Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very small. Not small in importance, just small in volume. This is not a story about lightning bolts or monster slaying or anyone dramatically throwing themselves off a cliff while shouting their own name. This is a story about a goddess who looked at all of that and politely declined. So if you can, dim the lights. Let your eyes get heavy. Maybe imagine a room that smells faintly of smoke and warm bread. Nothing is on fire in a bad way. Everything is exactly as contained as it should be. That's where we're starting tonight. Greek myths usually begin with chaos. Literally, chaos was there first. Then came everything else, loudly. But Hestia does not arrive like that. She doesn't burst into existence. She doesn't demand attention. She is simply there, like a hearth, like something that has been burning quietly before you walked into the room and will probably still be burning after you leave. Hestia is one of the original Olympians, which is already funny because she barely feels Olympian at all. She is the eldest child of Cronus and Rhea. Yes, that Cronus, the one who ate his children because prophecy made him anxious, a very healthy coping mechanism. Hestia was the first one swallowed, straight down, no thunder, no rebellion, just gulp. And then, much later, she was also the first one vomited back up, when Zeus finally decided to deal with his father's dietary habits. So technically, Hestia is both the oldest and the youngest of her siblings, depending on how you count time spent inside a Titan's stomach. Greek mythology is like that, very relaxed about timelines when digestion is involved. After that ordeal, you might expect Hestia to be intense, traumatized, vengeful. But no, if anything, she seems to have taken one long look at her family and decided that emotional distance was the correct path. Zeus grows up to throw lightning and sleep with everything. Hera becomes permanently furious. Poseidon starts earthquakes out of spite, Hades moves underground and never comes back, and Hestia just stays near the fire. She is the goddess of the hearth, of the home, of the quiet center of daily life. Not the exciting parts, not the weddings themselves, but the fire that cooks the wedding feast. Not the battles, but the place you return to afterward, exhausted and slightly disappointed in everyone involved. Every Greek household had a hearth, and that hearth belonged to Hestia. You didn't see her statue towering over cities. You felt her presence when the room was warm and nothing terrible was happening. Which is maybe why she's so easy to overlook. Ancient Greeks were very good at making gods dramatic. Hestia actively resisted that. She didn't have major temples the way others did. Her worship happened at home, at the center of the house. The hearth fire was sacred. You didn't just let it go out casually. If it did go out, that was a problem. A quiet problem, but still a problem. Hestia also took a vow of eternal virginity, which in Greek mythology is never a small decision. Usually it comes with consequences. Artemis does it and becomes aggressively feral about it. Athena does it and turns into strategy incarnate. Hestia does it and just keeps things running. She refuses marriage proposals from both Poseidon and Apollo, which is honestly impressive. Turning down one Olympian is risky. Turning down two, including the god of the sea and the god of the sun, suggests a very strong commitment to not dealing with anyone's nonsense. Zeus respects this vow, which tells you a lot about Hestia's role. Zeus does not respect most things, but he agrees that Hestia will remain untouched and undisturbed. In return, she tends the sacred fire of Olympus. While everyone else argues, cheats, plots, and transforms into animals for questionable reasons, Hestia keeps the place livable. She is stability in a family allergic to it. And yet, despite all this, she eventually gives up her seat among the 12 Olympians. She steps aside so Dionysus can take her place. Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and ecstatic chaos. This feels like a deliberate contrast. One quiet goddess quietly leaving so that a loud god can loudly arrive. And she does not complain, she does not argue, she just moves closer to the fire. This is important. Hestia does not vanish, she simply relocates. She becomes present everywhere instead of ruling from Olympus. Every city's public hearth, every home fire, every ritual offering begins with Hestia. The first and last libation goes to her. She frames the ritual without demanding the spotlight, which is a very Hestia thing to do. Greek myths often reward drama. Hestia is rewarded with consistency. She is always there. When colonies were founded, they took fire from the home city's hearth to light the new one. That fire was Hestia, a portable goddess, very low maintenance, no thunder required. There are not many stories about Hestia doing things, and that is kind of the point. She doesn't chase anyone, she doesn't curse anyone, she doesn't get transformed into a tree. There is one myth where Priapus tries to assault her while she's sleeping, and a donkey brays loudly, waking everyone and stopping him. And even that story ends not with vengeance, but with embarrassment. Priapus is mocked, Hestia remains untouched, the donkey becomes sacred, the vibe returns to normal. That is the most dramatic thing that happens to her, a failed attempt, a noise, then back to quiet. In art, Hestia is usually fully clothed, no dramatic poses, no intense expressions. She is modest, calm, often holding a flame. If you didn't know who she was, you might assume she was a background figure. And you would be right. She is the background that makes everything else possible. Greek religion was deeply tied to daily life, and Hestia is the god of daily life when nothing goes wrong. She represents continuity, the idea that no matter how absurd the gods become, someone still has to keep the fire burning. Someone still has to make sure the house does not go cold.
There is something deeply human about that. Hestia feels less like a story character and more like a concept that accidentally became divine. Warmth, safety, routine, the kind of things people only notice when they're gone. And maybe that's why she preferred the hearth to Olympus. Olympus is loud. It is full of grudges and shouting and immortal boredom. The hearth is quiet. It crackles. It smells faintly of smoke. It does not demand anything from you except that you tend it occasionally. So Hestia stays there, watching generations pass, watching myths grow louder and messier around her. She does not interfere, she does not judge, she just remains. Chapter 2. Olympus, where everyone is loud except the fire. Once you step away from Hestia's hearth, the temperature changes immediately. Not warmer or colder, just sharper. Olympus is not a place designed for rest. It is a place designed for watching other people make bad decisions forever. The other gods live very close together, emotionally and physically, which is never ideal. Immortality does not make them wiser, it just gives them more time to repeat the same arguments with slightly different disguises. And at the center of all of this noise, somehow, Hestia's fire keeps burning, quietly, patiently, unimpressed. Zeus, of course, is the loudest presence. He is the youngest of the Cronus survivors, which explains a lot. He grows up fast, overthrowing his father with a mixture of courage, cleverness, and extremely aggressive family planning. Once he becomes king of the gods, he immediately proves that leadership and impulse control are not related skills. Zeus does not sit calmly on a throne. He paces, he plots, he transforms into animals, he transforms into weather, he transforms into other people's husbands, which is honestly the most uncomfortable category. All of this happens while Hestia tends the fire. Hera, meanwhile, is technically the goddess of marriage. This is one of Greek mythology's longer jokes. Her marriage is an ongoing disaster. She is powerful, regal, and perpetually furious. Her anger is not random, it is focused, laser-focused. Zeus cheats, Hera retaliates, usually against the wrong person. This cycle continues indefinitely. If Olympus had a suggestion box, it would be on fire. Hestia does not participate. She does not take sides. She does not comment. She does not escalate. She does not turn anyone into an animal. She remains the only goddess who seems uninterested in proving a point. Poseidon lives nearby, but emotionally he might as well be several earthquakes away. He is moody, proud, and deeply resentful that Zeus got the sky. Poseidon wanted more. He always wants more. More land, more worship, more credit. When he doesn't get it, he floods something, or someone. He proposes to Hestia at one point, which is almost charming in a catastrophic way. She says no, calmly, permanently. Poseidon accepts this in the way he accepts most disappointments. He sulks, then he causes a natural disaster somewhere else. Apollo arrives on Olympus with music and prophecy and the kind of confidence that comes from being very good at many things and emotionally terrible at most of them. He also proposes to Hestia. This is less surprising. Apollo proposes to a lot of people. He is beautiful, talented, and cursed to be unsuccessful in love in increasingly creative ways. Hestia refuses him too. Not dramatically, not cruelly. She simply chooses not to engage. Apollo eventually moves on to other doomed romances. Daphne becomes a tree, Cassandra becomes cursed, Hyacinthus becomes a flower. Patterns emerge. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, is one of the few Olympians who seems to understand Hestia instinctively. Athena is strategic, controlled, and famously uninterested in romance. She and Hestia share something rare on Olympus: restraint. Athena handles the mind, Hestia handles the home. One plans the war, the other makes sure there is somewhere to sit afterward. Ares does not understand Hestia at all. Ares barely understands anything that isn't yelling or hitting. He is the god of war in its most chaotic form, not tactics, just violence. He thrives on conflict and noise. The hearth is meaningless to him. Ares has never noticed a fire unless it was burning something down. He exists as a reminder that power without patience becomes exhausting very quickly. Aphrodite floats through Olympus trailing desire, jealousy, and complications. She represents love, but not the comfortable kind, not the love that stays home and cooks quietly. She represents attraction that disrupts everything. She does not approve of Hestia's choices, but she does not challenge them either. Aphrodite understands preference. She just prefers chaos. Hermes moves constantly. Messenger, trickster, guide of souls. He crosses boundaries. He opens doors. He closes them. He probably stops by Hestia's fire more often than most, if only because everyone else is always yelling. Hermes appreciates transitions, and the hearth is the original transition point. Outside to inside, cold to warm, unknown to familiar. Even Hades, far below Olympus, mirrors Hestia in strange ways. He rules the underworld. She rules the home. Both are places people don't think about unless they have to. Both are inevitable. Both are quiet in their own way. Hades rarely leaves his realm. Hestia rarely leaves hers. Neither complains. They simply persist. When mortals interact with the gods, they often do so out of fear or desperation. They pray to Zeus for rain, to Apollo for healing, to Athena for guidance. But Hestia receives offerings without panic. A portion of every meal, the first sip of wine, the last sip of wine. She frames the ritual. She makes it safe. Before you ask the gods for anything dangerous, you acknowledge the fire that keeps you alive. In city-states, the public hearth is sacred. It represents the city itself. If the hearth goes out, the city has lost something essential. Colonists carry fire from the mother city to light the new one.
Hearth. This is not symbolic in a flashy way. It is practical. Fire is survival. Fire is continuity. Hestia is not a conqueror. She is a constant. And so while Olympus cycles through scandals, betrayals, and divine grudges that last centuries, Hestia remains unchanged. She does not grow bitter. She does not demand recognition. She does not withdraw her blessing. She simply exists. There is something almost defiant about that. In a mythological system that rewards spectacle, Hestia refuses it. She does not compete. She does not escalate. She steps aside when Dionysus arrives, bringing wine and madness and ecstatic rituals that spill into the streets. Hestia allows this. She does not resent him. She does not fight for her seat. She understands that the world needs noise sometimes. It just also needs a place to recover from it. Dionysus himself is a fascinating contrast. He's young, wild, and emotional. His followers lose themselves to dance and drink. Boundaries dissolve around him. This is not a threat to Hestia. It is the opposite of her domain, but not her enemy. After the festival ends, people still go home. They still need a fire. They still need quiet. So Olympus continues. Gods argue. Mortals suffer. Heroes rise and fall. And through it all, Hestia's presence remains understated and essential. If Greek mythology teaches anything here, it is that not every power needs to dominate. Some powers simply endure. The hearth does not chase you, it waits. It does not impress strangers, it comforts the familiar. It does not change the world dramatically, it makes the world livable. Chapter 3. Mortals, routines, and the holy boredom of daily life. Down among mortals, things move more slowly. Not because life is easier, just because it is smaller. Humans do not have lightning bolts or shape-shifting privileges. They have schedules, they have hunger, they have houses that get cold if someone forgets to tend the fire. This is where Hestia becomes most real. For a Greek family, the hearth is not decoration, it is the center of everything. Meals are cooked there, stories are told there. Children learn to sit still there, eventually. Ashes are cleaned out in the morning. Fire is fed again at night. This happens every day without ceremony, and yet it is sacred. Hestia lives here, not in spectacle, but in repetition. When a child is born, they are carried around the hearth, not once, several times. This is not for drama, this is introduction. You are shown to the fire. You are made part of the household. Hestia is the first god you meet, and she does not say anything. When a bride enters her new home, she is led to the hearth. When a slave is freed, they are brought to the hearth. When guests arrive, they are welcomed near the fire. Hospitality begins here. Before Zeus protects guests, before Athena tests them, the hearth decides whether you are safe. Hestia's worship does not involve ecstatic rituals or dramatic sacrifices. You do not need to scream or bleed or run through the woods. You give her the first portion of food. You give her the last. This is polite. It is also practical. You are acknowledging that without fire, none of this works. Greek religion does not separate sacred and ordinary life. Hestia embodies that. She does not interrupt the day. She is the day. Her presence is so constant that people forget it is religious at all, which is probably exactly how she likes it. Cities work the same way. Each polis has a central hearth, often located in the Prytaneum, the building where officials meet and guests are hosted. This fire is never allowed to go out, ever. Guards watch it. If it does go out, it is relit carefully, often with ritual purification. This is not superstition, this is identity. The city without its hearth is not whole. When Greeks establish colonies, they carry fire from the mother city, not soil, not statues, fire. This connects the new settlement to the old one. Hestia travels quietly, inside Embers. She does not announce herself. She arrives already burning. And yet, despite being everywhere, Hestia has very few myths. Mortals do not tell stories about her interfering. She does not curse families or bless heroes with unnatural luck. She is not the god you blame when things go wrong. If the house collapses, that is not Hestia's fault. If the fire goes out, that is human error. This makes her unique. Most gods are involved when something breaks. Hestia is involved when things continue. There is a strange humility to that, especially in a culture that admired heroic struggle. Greek heroes leave home to become famous. Odysseus spends 10 years trying to get back. Achilles leaves and dies young. Heracles leaves and never really returns. The Hearth waits for them anyway. Odysseus's story in particular makes Hestia's role clear by absence. Ithaca is not described as glorious. It is described as familiar. Smoke rising from hearths, the smell of food, the quiet endurance of Penelope, who keeps the household intact while chaos circles outside. Hestia is not Penelope, but she moves like her. She delays, she maintains, she refuses let the center collapse. In many ways, Greek women were expected to embody Hestia's qualities, not power or glory, but steadiness. This was not always fair. Often it was suffocating, but it reflects how deeply the hearth goddess shaped expectations. The home was sacred. Maintaining it was not nothing. It was everything, quietly. Even death does not fully remove Hestia's influence. Funerary rites begin at the hearth. The dead are part of the household until they are not. Transitions always pass through fire, always through warmth, always through something steady. Eventually, as Greek religion evolves, Hestia remains. She does not compete with new gods. She does not fade dramatically. In Rome, she becomes Vesta. The hearth becomes the heart of the state. Vestal virgins tend the eternal flame. The empire trusts its survival to a fire tended by women sworn to quiet discipline. This is Hestia's legacy, translated and scaled. And still, no drama. Hestia's power is not exciting. It is reliable, which is harder to maintain than it sounds. Anyone can start a fire. Keeping it going, day after day, through seasons and generations, requires attention, not passion. Attention.
So, while the myths celebrate battles and betrayals, life continues between them. People wake up, they eat, they warm their hands, they sleep, they do it again. Hestia is there for all of it. And perhaps that is why she chose the hearth over Olympus, not because she was weak, but because she understood something the others did not. Noise fades, routine endures. Later poets had a problem with Hestia, not because they disliked her, but because she gave them nothing to work with. No scandals, no feuds, no dramatic arcs. She did not fall, she did not rise, she did not change. She simply stayed. Greek myth, especially as it evolved into literature, thrives on motion. Characters want things, they fail, they suffer, they learn sometimes. Hestia wants very little, and she gets it almost immediately. A quiet place, a steady fire, minimal interaction with her relatives. Story over. This makes her uncomfortable for storytellers. Homer barely mentions her. Hesiod includes her in genealogies, dutifully, then moves on to gods who do something. Tragedians ignore her entirely. You cannot build a three-act structure around someone who resolves conflict by not engaging with it. There is no catharsis in watching a fire burn normally. And yet, she never disappears. She remains embedded in ritual language, in oaths, in the structure of prayer itself. First to Hestia, last to Hestia. The words are spoken automatically. People may not think about her consciously, but they feel wrong skipping her, like forgetting to lock the door at night. Nothing bad happens immediately, but you notice the absence. Philosophers, interestingly, understood her better. Plato associates the hearth with order, with the center. Aristotle understands the home as the foundation of the state. Neither of them turns Hestia into a metaphor aggressively. They just let her be what she already is: structure, stability, the thing everything else leans on while pretending not to. As Greek religion spreads and shifts, gods are reinterpreted. Zeus becomes more abstract, Apollo becomes more moral, Athena becomes more intellectual. Hestia does not need reinterpretation. She already fits everywhere. Every culture has fire. Every culture has a center. She translates without friction. When Rome adopts her as Vesta, the quiet goddess suddenly gains public importance without gaining personality. The Vestal virgins are among the most powerful women in Rome. They can pardon criminals, their testimony is unquestioned, and yet their job is the same as it always was: keep the fire going. Do not let it go out. The empire depends on it. No pressure. If the fire does go out, it is treated as a catastrophe, not a dramatic one, a moral one. Something has failed quietly, and now everything feels unstable. The solution is not punishment through spectacle, it is purification, correction, restoration. The fire is relit carefully. Order returns. This is Hestia's entire theology. Things break, you fix them, calmly. There is a strange modern resonance to that. We tend to admire disruption, innovation, change. We talk about shaking things up. Greek myth already explored that thoroughly, and most of it ended badly. Hestia offers the opposite model: not stagnation, maintenance. Maintenance is not glamorous. It does not produce heroes. It produces continuity. And continuity is what myths are made of, even when they pretend otherwise. Hestia's refusal to be interesting is not a flaw, it is a boundary. She does not owe the world a story. She gives it warmth instead. So, as myths grew louder and empires rose and fell, she stayed in the background, doing the same thing she had always had, burning steadily, waiting patiently, letting everyone else exhaust themselves. In a pantheon obsessed with legacy, Hestia chooses presence. In a mythology addicted to drama, she chooses silence. And perhaps that is why she endures, even when the stories stop being told. Fires are still lit, homes are still built around them, people still gather around warmth when the world feels too large. Hestia does not need an ending. She does not need a climax. She does not need a moral twist. She is already there in the room, doing exactly what she has always done. And we'll leave her there for now. The fire steady, the noise distant, the story unhurried. Once you understand Hestia, the rest of Greek mythology starts to feel a little insecure, because while she is content to remain at the center, doing nothing visibly impressive, everyone else is constantly proving themselves. Gods chase relevance, heroes chase fame, mortals chase favor. The hearth does none of this. It simply exists, quietly, judging no one, which somehow feels worse. Take the heroes, for example. Greek heroes are rarely motivated by peace. They want glory, kleos, their names remembered, songs sung about them long after they are dead. This is why they leave home in the first place. Home is safe. Home is repetitive. Home does not make you famous. And yet, nearly every heroic story eventually circles back to what was left behind. Heracles performs labors across the world, killing monsters and cleaning things no one else wants to clean. He does this because he cannot stay home. Home reminds him of what he has lost and what he has broken. There is no hearth for him that feels stable. His life is motion without rest. Hestia is absent not because she rejected him, but because he never stopped moving long enough to notice her.
Theseus leaves Athens to prove himself, fights monsters, becomes king, and immediately makes a mess of everything. His story is a long series of departures followed by failures to return properly. He forgets people, he forgets promises, he forgets to change the sails. The hearth is something he visits occasionally, like a memory he cannot quite hold on to. Jason gathers heroes, sails across the sea, and wins the Golden Fleece with a great deal of help he does not properly acknowledge. He returns home famous and immediately proves that fame does not make you good at domestic life. His marriage collapses, his house collapses. His story ends not in triumph, but in quiet ruin. No fire, no center, just exhaustion. Odysseus is the exception that proves the rule. His entire journey is defined by wanting to go home, not to rule, not to conquer, just to sit by his own fire again. He is clever, yes, resourceful, yes, but his true victory is domestic. He survives gods, monsters, and war, only to reclaim the hearth that waited for him. Even Achilles, the most famous of Greek warriors, is haunted by this contrast. He is given a choice, a short life with glory or a long, quiet life at home. He chooses glory, and the myths never stop reminding you what that costs. No hearth waits for Achilles, only memory. The gods mirror this restlessness. Zeus cannot stay faithful. Hera cannot let go of betrayal. Poseidon cannot accept limits. Apollo cannot maintain relationships. Artemis cannot tolerate intrusion. Ares cannot stop fighting. Aphrodite cannot create love without consequence. Dionysus cannot bring joy without unraveling something else along the way. Every one of them is in motion, emotionally, mythologically, endlessly. Hestia remains still. This does not make her superior in a dramatic sense. Greek myth does not reward stillness with applause, but it makes her necessary. All this motion requires a reference point, a center, something unmoving that gives meaning to leaving and returning. Without Hestia, heroes would just wander. With her, they are defined by absence. This may be why she fades from the stories, but not from the culture. Myths are about disruption. Life is about maintenance. Hestia belongs to life. As Greek religion slowly gives way to philosophy, then to empire, then to new belief systems, the old gods lose their literal power. Temples fall, oracles go silent, names become stories, but the hearth remains. Even when people stop calling her Hestia, they keep her habits. The center of the home, the gathering place, the quiet ritual of beginning and ending with warmth. In a way, Hestia wins by not competing. She outlasts spectacle by refusing it. And so Greek mythology, for all its noise, always quietly acknowledges her first. Before the prayer, before the request, before the drama, there is the fire, there is the center, there is the thing that does not change just because everything else insists on doing so. Let that be the rhythm we settle into now, the slow burn, the steady presence. Chapter 6, Leaving the Fire and Realizing Too Late Why It Mattered. There is a pattern in Greek mythology that becomes very obvious once you stop looking at the gods and start looking at the doorways. People are always leaving. They leave homes, they leave parents, they leave warmth, they leave routine. Sometimes they leave willingly, sometimes they are pushed out by fate, prophecy, or someone else's mistake. But leaving is constant. It is almost compulsory. Staying is rarely celebrated. And Hestia is always the thing they leave behind. Young men leave to become heroes. Young women leave to become wives. Children leave to become adults. Kings leave to fight wars they could have avoided. The hearth stays where it is. It does not chase anyone down the road asking them to reconsider. This makes the return, when it happens, emotionally heavy. Because return is never just physical, it is comparison. what you were versus what you are now, what the fire was then versus what it feels like now. Many characters fail this comparison badly. Agamemnon returns from Troy convinced that victory excuses everything. He brings Cassandra with him as if the hearth will simply absorb that insult. It does not. His house is poisoned. The fire is cold. He is dead almost immediately. The hearth remembers what he forgot. Orestes grows up away from home, then returns to avenge it. His story is violent and loud and morally exhausting. But notice where judgment finally happens. Not on a battlefield, not in a storm, in a structured space, a place of order, a symbolic center. The chaos has to be brought back to something stable before it ends. Even gods struggle with return. Demeter leaves Olympus when Persephone is taken. The earth freezes, crops fail, life stops. When Persephone partially returns, the world resumes, imperfectly. This is a seasonal myth, yes, but it is also domestic. The absence of the hearth is famine. The partial return is survival. Hestia does not participate in this myth directly. She doesn't need to. Her role is implied. When Demeter returns, when warmth returns, when the home is whole again, Hestia is already there.
There are also those who never return properly. Icarus leaves too high. Phaeton leaves control entirely. Bellerophon tries to reach Olympus itself. These are not just stories about hubris. They are stories about abandoning limits, about mistaking movement for meaning. None of them have a hearth waiting at the end. Their stories stop mid-air. Greek myth is full of warnings disguised as adventures. Leave if you must, but know what you are leaving. And yet, the myths rarely tell you to stay. They assume you won't. Staying is quiet. Staying does not build statues. Staying does not get sung about. Staying looks like nothing happening, and myths hate nothing happening. So Hestia is not the protagonist of Greek mythology. She is the baseline it keeps running away from. This becomes even clearer when you look at how Greeks imagined exile. Exile is not just punishment. It is disconnection from the hearth, from the ancestors, from the fire that marked you as belonging somewhere. An exiled person is someone without Hestia. They survive, maybe, but they do not settle. Which makes hospitality sacred. To welcome a stranger to your hearth is to temporarily give them a center again. This is why violating hospitality is one of the few sins the gods take seriously. You are messing with someone's last access to warmth and safety. Even Zeus cares about that. Eventually. In this way, Hestia quietly governs morality, not through laws, through presence. If the hearth is intact, behavior tends to follow. When it collapses, everything else becomes negotiable. This may be why later cultures struggled to replace her. You can swap out gods of war. You can reinterpret gods of wisdom. But the hearth is not optional. It does not evolve easily. It simply gets renamed. And even in modern retellings of Greek myth, where gods are reimagined as superheroes or metaphors or psychological forces, Hestia is often missing. Not because she doesn't fit, but because she fits too well. She blends in. She looks like background, like furniture, like a room that is only noticeable when it is empty. But the stories still orbit her absence. Every hero who wants to go home, every villain who cannot, every god who causes chaos and then disappears, they all define themselves against a center they do not control. And Hestia remains, quietly unbothered. So as we move further into Greek myth, away from the hearth and into louder territory, keep that contrast in mind. All this movement,
all this ambition, all this noise? Chapter 7. Restless Heroes and the Invisible Anchor. Now that we've spent some time with the Hearth, it's worth noticing just how much Greek mythology is obsessed with leaving. Not everyone leaves, of course, but the loudest stories, the ones that get told again and again, are about people who abandon the safety and warmth of home. And it's always interesting to observe what happens when they do. Take Perseus, for example. He is technically a hero, though not a particularly introspective one. His journey begins when his grandfather, Polydectes, tries to manipulate him into impossible tasks. Perseus leaves home to face Medusa. He returns later with her head and a bride. Sounds triumphant, yes. But notice the quiet truth. The journey is long, dangerous, and clever, yet the hearth he left behind barely gets a mention. Home exists, presumably, but the focus is on what he did while he was gone. And yet, it is the fire he left behind that has allowed him to go at all. It gave him identity, stability, courage without drama. Then there's Bellerophon, who might be the cautionary tale version of Perseus. He starts with success, defeating monsters, taming Pegasus, but eventually tries to fly too close to Olympus itself. He overreaches. He is cast down. He survives, but broken and blind, wandering the earth. His failure is not in battle, but in ignoring limits. He sought something higher, faster, louder, and lost sight of the quiet anchor waiting for him at home. Odysseus is another study in this pattern, and perhaps the most famous one. His journey is decades long. He is brilliant, cunning, clever, persistent, yet the true measure of his story is the return. All his adventures, monsters, and temptations are merely a prelude to coming home. The hearth, which in real terms is Penelope's patience and Ithaca's familiar walls, becomes the center of his narrative. Without it, his story lacks gravity. His heroism is framed against a place that exists without drama. Again, you can see Hestia's influence. Even if she doesn't appear, she is implied. In this way, Hestia quietly governs morality, not through laws, through presence. If the hearth is intact, behavior tends to follow. When it collapses, everything else becomes negotiable. This may be why later cultures struggled to replace her. You can swap out gods of war, you can reinterpret gods of wisdom, but the hearth is not optional. It does not evolve easily, it simply gets renamed. And even in modern retellings of Greek myth, where gods are reimagined as superheroes or metaphors or psychological forces, Hestia is often missing, not because she doesn't fit, but because she fits too well. She blends in, she looks like background, like furniture, like a room that is only noticeable when it is empty. But the stories still orbit her absence. Every hero who wants to go home, every villain who cannot, every god who causes chaos and then disappears, they all define themselves against a center they do not control. And Hestia remains, quietly unbothered. So as we move further into Greek myth, away from the hearth and into louder territory, keep that contrast in mind. All this movement, all this ambition, all this noise.
Something quietly sustaining the foundation. None of it would matter. It is Hestia's absence, or rather her quiet presence, that gives motion meaning. And so, as we continue, we'll keep noticing these contrasts. The restless versus the still, the dramatic versus the mundane, the heroes who never settle, and the one constant that observes them, unmoved and essential, like a room that is only noticed when it is empty. Chapter 8. The Cost of Ignoring the Hearth. Greek myths are full of warnings disguised as excitement. They tell us that leaving home, seeking fame, or pursuing desires without restraint can be dangerous. But beneath the monsters, battles, and prophecies, there is a subtler lesson. Neglect the hearth at your peril. Not in an explosive storybook way, but quietly, structurally, fundamentally. Take the story of Oedipus, for instance. He leaves Corinth because of a prophecy he cannot understand properly. He believes he is avoiding disaster. Instead, he walks straight into it. There are no monsters on the road, no swords or sorcery, just choices, mistakes, and the inevitability of fate. And all the while, he is disconnected from what home might have provided, a center, a sense of belonging, a moral compass that comes from continuity rather than prophecy. The tragedy is not simply that he kills his father and marries his mother. The tragedy is that he left the hearth behind, both literally and metaphorically, and walked blindly into chaos. Even when people are not cursed by prophecy, leaving the hearth behind can have consequences. Take the Argonauts. They leave Iolcus for fame, adventure, and glory. Along the way, they achieve remarkable feats. But when they return, nothing is as simple as it should be. Jason's family and household are fractured. His accomplishments do not make him whole. The fire he abandoned is cold. In a mythological sense, what he gains outside cannot replace what he loses inside the home. This idea repeats endlessly. Greek heroes, Perseus, Theseus, Heracles, are all defined by motion. Their courage and cleverness matter because someone waits behind them. Someone like Hestia or her mortal equivalents makes the story legible. Without a hearth, the story loses gravity. Achievements float like smoke. Without a center, there is no framework, only chaos pretending to be drama. Even the gods are affected. Demeter leaves Olympus after Persephone is taken, and the world freezes. Crops fail. People suffer quietly, almost unnoticed, until order is restored. The absence of the hearth here is literal and cosmic. This is a pattern in Greek myth. When stability is abandoned, everything else suffers. Not dramatically, not with immediate vengeance, but slowly, persistently, unavoidably. Mortals, of course, internalize these lessons in everyday life. To neglect the hearth is to risk family, community, and survival. The first portion of food goes to Hestia. The last portion goes to Hestia. Even in simple, repetitive acts, continuity matters. Fire is survival. Routine is morality. Quiet maintenance, often overlooked in stories, is essential to life itself. This is why exile is such a serious punishment in Greek myth. A person cut off from the hearth is not just displaced, they are unmoored. They lose social, spiritual, and emotional grounding. Their actions, no matter how heroic, are less effective because there is no center from which to return. They are lost in a way that cannot be corrected by courage, strength, or cunning. Only recognition of the center and return to it restores balance. Hestia herself never intervenes to correct errors. She does not punish, she does not reward, she does not chase anyone down the road. Her power is subtle. It is present in absence. The fire burns quietly while the world grows louder, and that quiet endurance is what ultimately structures the chaos around it. Even the loudest myths, when examined closely, revolve around departure from the hearth. Heroes leave, fail, and sometimes return. Gods leave, scheme, and occasionally reconcile. Mortals wander, suffer, and occasionally find their way back to warmth. In every case, the story only makes sense against the backdrop of an unchanging center. This pattern is not limited to a few stories, it is almost universal. Every myth that involves journeying, ambition, or conflict presumes an origin point, a home, a hearth, a place to return. That is why Hestia, though often invisible in narrative, is structurally indispensable. Without her, myths would still happen, but they would float untethered, lacking context, morality, and grounding. And so the cost of ignoring the hearth is both practical and existential. Fire goes out, homes collapse, communities fail, and in myths, even when disaster strikes subtly, the reader senses the absence of continuity. The unremarkable, the mundane, the quiet persistence,
That is Hestia's domain, and the world feels it whenever it is ignored. Chapter 9. Journeys that fail without a fire. If you pay attention to Greek myths long enough, you begin to notice a pattern. The longer someone is away from home, the worse things tend to go. It's almost statistical. Heroes, kings, and mortals who leave their hearths for glory, adventure, or curiosity rarely manage to return unscathed. Not because the world is cruel, though it can be, but because the hearth, the quiet anchor of stability, is absent while they wander. Take the story of Theseus. He leaves Athens as a young man to prove himself, slays the Minotaur, and returns triumphant, or so the story seems. But his personal life quickly unravels. Forgetfulness, bad choices, and miscommunication plague his household. He forgets to change the sails on his ship, leading to the death of his father. Glory outside cannot replace attentiveness at home. The hearth he abandoned exacts its quiet toll. Heracles is another example, though more extreme. His labors take him across the known world, facing monsters, cleaning up other people's problems, and performing deeds that will be sung about for millennia. But his domestic life is a disaster. His family suffers, accidentally or intentionally, and tragedies accumulate. The fire at home, figurative and literal, is left unattended. Even a hero cannot outrun the consequences of neglecting the center. Odysseus famously spends 10 years trying to return to Ithaca. His journey is framed entirely around homecoming. Unlike others, his myth explicitly ties success and identity to the hearth. Every monster, every distraction, every temptation is secondary to returning to that central fire. Without the hearth, the epic loses all meaning. His cuning, resilience, and perseverance is not conquest, it is reintegration. He becomes heroic only because the fire awaits him. Then there's the story of Agamemnon, whose absence from home has disastrous consequences. He leaves for Troy, leaving his household and kingdom in limbo. Upon returning, he finds betrayal, loss, and death waiting. The fire of his home is metaphorically cold, and the narrative punishes him not with combat, but with domestic collapse. The hearth is the unspoken judge of his journey. Even mortals who leave for less heroic purposes suffer quietly. Exiles, travelers, and those who ignore domestic duties experience consequences that are less dramatic but no less real. Fires go out, families fragment, community trust erodes. Life becomes more precarious, not because of external forces alone, but because the stabilizing center has been abandoned.
This pattern is repeated in minor myths and local stories too. Colonists who carry embers from the mother city are reminded that the hearth is central to identity and continuity. If the fire goes out, the colony risks spiritual and social collapse. Starting anew is never truly about land or resources. It's about maintaining that quiet, essential presence that gives life structure. Hestia's influence is subtle but universal. In Greek myth, you rarely see Hestia actively intervening. She does not chase heroes, she does not punish them, she does not travel to restore order. Her power is structural. It is implied in the very notion of home, fire, and domestic responsibility. Stories only make sense against the backdrop of her existence, whether she is consciously present or not. Even the gods, who are immortal and capable of enormous feats, recognize the importance of the hearth indirectly. Demeter's grief freezes the earth when Persephone is gone. Zeus cares about hospitality. Mortals and immortals alike suffer consequences for neglecting the center, often subtly, sometimes catastrophically. Hestia's quiet presence contrasts sharply with the constant motion and ambition around her. She does not leave, yet her absence is felt whenever anyone else wanders too far. She does not compete for attention, yet every story is contextualized by what she represents: stability, endurance, and continuity. The mythic universe is loud, messy, and endlessly restless, but the hearth, the quiet, steady fire, remains essential. Without it, heroes are hollow, kingdoms are unstable, and adventures lose moral and structural weight. Chapter 10. Small negligence, quiet catastrophes. Greek mythology is obsessed with dramatic failure.
But sometimes the most instructive disasters are quiet ones, not thunderbolts or monsters, not epic battles or divine punishments, just ordinary negligence that accumulates until it cannot be ignored. And almost always, it involves leaving the hearth unattended, literally or metaphorically. Take the story of the daughters of Danaus. They were supposed to marry the sons of Egyptus. They fled their assigned marriages, avoiding violence by killing their husbands on the wedding night, or in some versions, attempting, failing, or being stopped. The myth is loud, yes, but underneath all that drama is a more subtle failure. The household, the hearth, the domestic continuity was abandoned. The center that sustains a family was disrupted. Even when heroes and villains try to act, neglecting home destabilizes everything. Another example appears in the minor myths of failed colonists. Greek city-states often sent settlers to new lands, carrying embers from the mother city. The fire was symbolic, yes, but also practical. Colonists who failed to maintain it often experienced social collapse, famine, or loss of legitimacy. There are no monsters in these stories, just quiet decay. Without a center, life unravels slowly, sometimes unnoticed until it is too late. Even the gods face this principle indirectly. Hermes may wander, but messages fail when he is distracted. Apollo's prophecies are useless if mortals ignore them. Even divine order requires acknowledgement of the quiet framework that underpins everything. Hestia provides that framework. She does not intervene actively, but her absence, or the failure to honor her, creates subtle accumulating consequences. Consider the story of the Spartan hearth. In one account, neglect of domestic rituals caused widespread misfortune. The fires went out, families grew careless, rituals were skipped. There was no immediate drama, no earthquake or plague, but over time, the city recognized that stability had failed. The lesson is quiet but clear. Without attention to continuity, small problems cascade. Hestia's domain is not flashy, but it is unforgiving in its own way. This principle extends to ordinary mortals in Greek literature. Travelers who ignore domestic responsibilities find that their absence has a ripple effect. Crops fail, alliances weaken, children suffer. In epic terms, these events are minor, but cumulatively they define the outcome of lives, lineages, and city-states. In other words, Greek myth teaches that drama is not the only metric of consequence. Quiet negligence, lack of attention to continuity, and abandonment of the hearth produce real failures. Hestia embodies what is most easily overlooked, that survival, identity, and moral stability depend on the mundane, the repetitive, the ordinary acts of care and attention. Even when characters believe they are pursuing heroism or glory, leaving the center behind almost always undermines them. Odysseus's homecoming is meaningful because the hearth awaited him. Jason's return is tragic because he neglected it. Heroes and mortals alike are defined not only by their actions, but by their relationship to the unchanging center that Hestia represents. In this sense, Hestia is both omnipresent and invisible. Her domain is stability, her power is endurance, and her influence is felt in absence more than presence. Myths, noisy as they are, quietly revolve around her. Stories of departure, ambition, and failure make sense only in contrast to the hearth. Chapter 11. Ironic Consequences of Neglect. Greek mythology is obsessed with dramatic failure, but sometimes the most instructive disasters are quiet ones. Not thunderbolts or monsters, not epic battles or divine punishments, just ordinary negligence that accumulates until it cannot be ignored. And almost always, it involves leaving the hearth unattended, literally or metaphorically. Take the story of the daughters of Danaus. They were supposed to marry the sons of Egyptus. They fled their assigned marriages, avoiding violence by killing their husbands on the wedding night, or in some versions, attempting, failing, or being stopped. The myth is loud, yes, but underneath all that drama is a more subtle failure. The household, the hearth, the domestic continuity was abandoned. The center that sustains a family was disrupted. Even when heroes and villains try to act, neglecting home destabilizes everything. Another example appears in the minor myths of failed colonists. Greek city-states often sent settlers to new lands, carrying embers from the mother city. The fire was symbolic, yes, but also practical. Colonists who failed to maintain it often experienced social collapse, famine, or loss of legitimacy. There are no monsters in these stories, just quiet decay. Without a center, life unravels slowly, sometimes unnoticed until it is too late. Even the gods face this principle indirectly. Hermes may wander, but messages fail when he is distracted. Apollo's prophecies are useless if mortals ignore them. Even divine order requires acknowledgement of the quiet framework that underpins everything. Hestia provides that framework. She does not intervene actively, but her absence, or the failure to honor her, creates subtle, accumulating consequences.
Even among the gods, irony emerges when the hearth is ignored or undervalued. Apollo, obsessed with fame and prophecy, can see the future, but cannot guarantee adherence to continuity. Mortals may disregard his words, and the consequences ripple unpredictably. Zeus himself punishes hubris, but often only after the structural neglect has compounded. Hestia is rarely involved directly. Her power is implied. Everything functions poorly until attention is returned to the steady center. Mortals, too, demonstrate ironic consequences in daily life. A household that fails to tend the hearth may appear functional at first. Dinner is cooked, tasks are completed, but over time, rituals lapse, traditions decay, and relationships fray. Children learn instability rather than structure. Guests and strangers experience disorder rather than hospitality. The small, unremarkable fire turns out to be the moral compass of ordinary life. Neglected, and chaos seeps in imperceptibly until finally someone notices, and it is often too late to fix entirely. Even the legendary hero Theseus offers a quiet example. His long absences, his misjudgments at home, and his failure to communicate effectively lead to domestic collapse and tragedy. Not battles, not monsters, but ordinary mismanagement compounded over time. The irony is striking. His heroism is remembered in songs and stories, but his household suffers because the hearth was neglected. Fame outside the home cannot compensate for what is lost inside. Hestia's role, therefore, is ironic in its own way. She is essential and invisible. She is the anchor that is most felt when ignored. She never acts to punish or intervene, yet her absence produces some of the clearest consequences in both mortal and divine narratives. The quietest goddess commands the most subtle, persistent power. Chapter 12. The quiet center behind every loud myth. If you start looking closely at Greek myths, you realize that no matter how dramatic or violent a story appears, it almost always depends on something quiet and constant in the background. Usually, it's not a sword, a prophecy, or even a god's intervention. It's the hearth, it's the home, it's Hestia, in her invisible but structurally critical role. Take the story of Persephone and Demeter again. The myth is loud and memorable. Persephone is abducted, Demeter grieves, the earth stops producing crops and everything freezes. It's dramatic, yes, but the underlying logic of the myth relies on the idea of a center. The household, the hearth, the ordered structure of life, these are what make Demeter's grief meaningful. Without a place of origin, without continuity to disrupt, the drama would have no weight. The story functions because it contrasts movement with stability, absence with presence. That stability is Hestia's domain, even if she is never mentioned directly. Heroes like Odysseus also illustrate this principle. His adventures are full of monsters, temptations, and divine interference, but all of it is framed by one persistent goal: returning home. Ithaca, Penelope, the hearth, all quiet, steady, and unremarkable, serve as the reference point for his entire journey. Without them, the story of the Odyssey would just be a series of episodes in random locations, lacking emotional resonance. It is the unglamorous center that makes heroic exploits meaningful. Even violent or chaotic myths, Heracles, Jason, or Theseus are structured around absence and return. You can have extraordinary feats, but myths constantly compare these feats against the ordinary, stable world left behind. When that stability is neglected, tragedy occurs. When it is preserved or restored, meaning is restored. Hestia's presence, or the attention to her domain, is implied in almost every myth, whether through the household, the family, or the city. Minor myths reinforce this too. Colonists carry embers of the hearth when founding new settlements. Mortals perform daily rituals to feed the fire. Guests are welcomed near it. Failures to maintain it produce consequences that are quiet but cumulative. Social instability, family tension, and ritual contamination. It is never flashy, but it is deeply consequential. The myths treat Hestia's domain as the connective tissue that allows all other events to make sense. Even the gods indirectly recognize the hearth's importance. Zeus punishes hubris, Poseidon reacts to imbalance, and Apollo delivers prophecies. But the structural stability that allows mortals and gods alike to operate is never questioned. It exists in the background. Its absence is always felt. Hestia does not need to act. She is essential because continuity itself is essential. This brings us back to the key insight. Greek mythology is loud, chaotic, and obsessive about heroism, ambition, and disaster. But beneath all of that, the quiet, unremarkable elements, the hearth, the home, the center, are what make the stories coherent. Without them, the adventures lack meaning, the tragedies lose weight, and even the gods' actions feel unmoored. Hestia's presence is subtle, but she is the invisible anchor that defines everything else. And so as we drift further into the chaos of Greek myths, remember the hearth. Every journey, every battle, every mistake is measured against what is left behind, a quiet fire, steady and unassuming, quietly observing while the world performs its endless drama. Chapter 13. When Neglect Outweighs Heroism. Greek myths loved to celebrate heroes who act boldly, face monsters, and travel far from home. But there's a subtle pattern that often goes unnoticed. Even the most courageous hero can fail if they neglect the hearth, the steady center that Hestia represents. Action and bravery are meaningless without continuity. This is a quiet lesson embedded in story after story, quietly shaping outcomes while the dramatic events take center stage. Take the example of Jason and the Argonauts. His expedition to retrieve the Golden Fleece is one of the most famous adventures in Greek mythology. He achieves incredible feats, faces impossible challenges, and even secures the help of gods along the way. But when he returns home, his household collapses. His wife Medea enacts vengeance. His children die. Glory outside the home cannot compensate for neglect within it. The hearth, the literal and metaphorical center of family and community, was ignored while Jason chased fame. His narrative is a textbook example of what happens when heroism outpaces attentiveness. Heracles provides another illustration. His labors span the known world, from slaying monsters to completing tasks no one else dares attempt. Yet his domestic life is disastrous. His absence and failures at home cause suffering for those he loves most. Heroic deeds are remembered, yes, but domestic neglect leaves consequences that are quietly catastrophic. The lesson is consistent. Bravery or talent cannot substitute for attention to the center, the domestic, the ordinary acts that maintain stability.
Even lesser-known figures reflect this principle. Cadmus, the founder of Thebes, experiences tragedy not simply because of external threats, but because establishing a city requires ongoing care and attention. Failures in ritual observance, household management, and adherence to condition bring slow, cumulative misfortune. The stories of cities, colonists, and families in Greek myth reinforce the same point. The hearth matters more than spectacle.
Mortals in everyday life mirror these mythic lessons. Neglecting family, community duties, or the small repetitive rituals that sustain order produces consequences that are invisible at first, then unavoidable. Fires go out, traditions erode, children lose guidance, alliances weaken. Nothing dramatic happens immediately, but slowly, quietly, disorder accumulates until collapse is inevitable. Hestia's domain, the fire, the center, the quiet anchor, is what allows life to function, even when heroes, gods, and mortals believe the real work is done elsewhere. Even gods indirectly validate this pattern. Zeus and Poseidon may quarrel, Apollo may prophesy, and Demeter may grieve, but the framework of the home, the continuity of rituals, and the integrity of social bonds remain foundational. They recognize, consciously or not, that Hestia's quiet domain provides the structure within which all other action gains significance. This is why Greek myth repeatedly contrasts the loud with the quiet, the ambitious with the attentive. Heroism without return, adventure without reintegration, glory without stability, these are recipes for subtle but profound disaster. Hestia does not intervene, she does not act spectacularly, but her absence or the failure to honor her domain amplifies consequences everywhere. And so, as we continue drifting through Greek mythology, it is worth paying attention to the quiet, mundane, and consistent elements, the hearth, the home, the rituals that give meaning to even the most spectacular stories. They are invisible, uncelebrated, yet they define success, failure, and morality in ways that dramatic action alone never could.
Heroes demonstrate this as well. Heracles' labors are celebrated across the mythological canon, but his household suffers quietly during his absence. Jason achieves glory with the Golden Fleece, yet the domestic sphere collapses upon his return. Glory and adventure cannot compensate for neglecting the hearth. These myths underscore a consistent message. Attention to the center is more consequential than spectacular heroism. Mortals, too, experience subtle consequences in everyday life. Ignoring small duties, failing to maintain rituals, or neglecting domestic obligations produces gradual disorder. Children grow up with instability, families fracture, alliances weaken. Greek myths treat these outcomes with understated severity, showing that negligence in the mundane sphere can be as consequential as overt heroism or divine wrath. Even gods recognize this pattern indirectly. Demeter freezes the earth in grief when Persephone is taken, demonstrating that absence from the center produces cascading effects. Zeus punishes hubris, but only after the consequences of negligence accumulate. Apollo's prophecies are ineffectual when ignored. Hestia herself does not act, but her domain, the steady, unassuming center, structures outcomes across mythic and mortal worlds alike. The irony is striking. Greek myths glorify adventure, courage, and ambition, yet the most persistent, long-lasting effects often come from very ordinary failures. Not spectacular misdeeds or heroic blunders, but small, mundane lapses, failing to tend a fire, neglecting ritual, abandoning the center. Hestia's influence is always present, shaping outcomes through what is maintained or ignored, rather than through dramatic intervention. Consider minor stories of colonists and settlers. They carried embers from their mother city when founding new communities. These embers were not just symbolic, they were literal representations of continuity. When settlers neglected the fire, skipped rituals, or failed to maintain order in their new homes, the consequences were subtle but real. Social cohesion faltered, crops failed, and traditions decayed. Nothing immediate or dramatic happened, no monster struck,
No god descended with fury, but over time the community destabilized. The quiet center, unattended, exacted its toll. Heroes also experience these consequences in surprisingly mundane ways. Heracles takes him far from home, leaving his household to struggle in his absence. Jason achieves glory with the Golden Fleece, yet upon returning, his domestic life collapses. These myths illustrate a consistent pattern. Heroic exploits alone cannot compensate for neglecting the hearth, the center, the routine. The ordinary attentiveness to home and family matters more than spectacular action. Even mortal life in Greek mythology emphasizes the same principle. Neglecting domestic duties, failing to honor rituals, or forgetting ordinary responsibilities produces slow, cumulative disorder. Children grow up with instability, families fracture, alliances weaken. Greek myths treat these consequences seriously, even when they are quiet or understated. Hestia's domain, the fire, the center, the hearth, is the invisible structure that determines whether heroism or ambition ultimately succeeds. The gods also acknowledge this indirectly. Demeter's grief when Persephone is taken causes famine, showing the ripple effects of absence from the center. Zeus punishes hubris, but only after negligence has compounded. Apollo's prophecies are ineffectual if ignored. Hestia herself does not act, but her domain, the steady, unassuming center, structures outcomes across mythic and mortal worlds alike. The irony is striking. Greek myths glorify adventure, courage, and ambition, yet the most persistent, shaping force remains quiet, invisible, and mundane. The hearth, the home, the daily rituals of attentiveness, these are what truly anchor life. Ignore them, and even heroes and gods can fail. Maintain them, and ordinary continuity sustains generations.
There is a quiet irony here. Greek myths glorify heroism, adventure, and extraordinary feats, yet the most consequential force is mundane, invisible, and uncelebrated. Hestia teaches that neglect of ordinary duties carries profound consequences. Fires left unattended, rituals skipped, domestic care ignored. These minor failures produce disasters that can quietly shape entire lives. As we move forward, we'll explore additional myths in which seemingly trivial oversights escalate into significant consequences, highlighting again the subtle, indispensable influence of the hearth and the quiet power it exerts over mortals, heroes, and gods alike. Chapter 18. Small mistakes with lasting echoes. Greek myths are full of noise, battles, monsters, and heroic feats, but some of the most enduring lessons come from quiet, ordinary failures. It is rarely the dramatic moment that defines a life or a city. It is the unattended hearth, the skipped ritual, the neglected duty that ripples outward slowly but persistently. Hestia's influence is invisible yet essential, quietly structuring the world even as chaos swirls around it. Consider minor myths about colonists. Founders carried embers from their mother city when establishing new settlements. These embers represented continuity, legitimacy, and domestic stability. If the fire was neglected, or if rituals surrounding it were ignored, subtle disasters followed. Crops failed, social structures weakened, and traditions eroded. Nothing exploded, nothing was destroyed in a single dramatic moment, but over time, disorder accumulated. The hearth, constant and unassuming, was the silent guardian of their survival. Heroes illustrate the same principle. Heracles' labors span the known world, yet his family suffered quietly in his absence. Jason secures the Golden Fleece, but upon returning, his domestic life collapsed. The message is clear. Bravery, strength, or cunning cannot replace attention to the center. Glory outside the home is meaningless if the hearth is neglected.
The ordinary, mundane care of home and ritual shapes outcomes far more profoundly than spectacular action. Mortals in everyday Greek myth experience similar consequences. Missing a ritual, neglecting domestic duties, or failing to maintain ordinary obligations may seem trivial at first, yet slowly instability grows. Families fracture, children lack guidance, alliances weaken, communities falter. Greek myths treat these consequences seriously, though quietly. Hestia's power is structural, invisible, and persistent, quietly anchoring all life. Even the gods recognize this indirectly. Demeter's grief freezes the earth when Persephone is taken, highlighting the effects of absence from the center. Zeus punishes hubris, but only after cumulative neglect has created disorder. Apollo's prophecies fall flat when ignored. Hestia herself does not intervene. Her power is structural, not performative. The world functions because of her quiet influence and falters when it is disregarded. There is a quiet, almost ironic lesson here. Greek myths celebrate adventure, heroism, and extraordinary acts, yet the most profound influence is invisible, mundane, and uncelebrated. Hestia reminds us that neglect of the ordinary, the fire, the home, the center, can create consequences far more enduring than any hero's triumphs. Chapter 20. When the small things tip the scales. Greek myths love grandeur, heroic feats, epic battles, and the meddling of gods, but the truly enduring lessons often come from quiet, overlooked acts, tending the hearth, maintaining rituals, and preserving domestic and civic order. Hestia's influence is invisible, but it shapes outcomes across generations. Neglected, and even heroes and gods feel the consequences. Take the story of minor settlers and colonists. They carried embers from their mother cities, a literal and symbolic connection to continuity. Neglecting the fire, even briefly, led to subtle failures. Crops failed, rituals were forgotten, communities struggled socially and spiritually. There was no immediate catastrophe, no monster, no divine wrath, but slowly everything unraveled. These stories show that Hestia's quiet influence is essential. Attention to the ordinary care sustains life itself. Heroes illustrate the same principle. Heracles' labors span the known world, yet his family suffered quietly in his absence. Jason secures the Golden Fleece, but upon returning, his domestic life collapsed. The message is clear. Bravery, strength, or cunning cannot replace attention to the center. Domestic care, continuity, and routine, mundane responsibilities, carry consequences that outlast even the most spectacular adventures.
Even mortals in everyday Greek myth reflect the same principle. Skipping a ritual, ignoring domestic duties, or failing to maintain ordinary obligations creates cascading effects. Children grow up in instability, families fracture, alliances weaken, and communities falter. The myths treat these outcomes with understated seriousness. Hestia's domain, the hearth, continuity, stability, is the invisible framework on which all life depends. The gods acknowledge this indirectly. Demeter freezes the earth when Persephone is taken, illustrating how absence from the center produces wide-reaching consequences. Zeus punishes hubris, but only after the cumulative effects of negligence become apparent. Apollo's prophecies are useless if ignored. Hestia herself does not intervene. Her power is structural rather than performative. The world functions properly only when attention is paid to the center. There is a quiet irony in all this. Greek myths celebrate adventure, heroism, and spectacle, yet the most lasting influence comes from mundane, uncelebrated acts of care. Fires left unattended, rituals skipped, domestic duties ignored. These minor failures often produce consequences far greater than any dramatic battle. Hestia's invisible power is the quiet scale upon which success, failure, and morality are measured. Chapter 21. Quiet neglect, lasting imbalance. As Greek myths unfold, a pattern becomes increasingly clear. It is not only heroism, divine favor, or dramatic events that shape outcomes, but the ordinary, invisible acts of care, or their absence. Hestia's domain, the hearth and the quiet center, governs stability in ways that are rarely celebrated, but deeply consequential. Neglected, and even the most remarkable feats of courage or cleverness cannot prevent imbalance. Consider minor myths of colonists. Founders carried embers from their mother cities when establishing new settlements. These fires represented continuity, legitimacy, and domestic stability. When neglected, rituals skipped, embers left unattended, subtle consequences followed. Crops failed, social cohesion weakened, and traditions eroded. Nothing spectacular happened, no divine wrath fell immediately, but over time the community faltered. Hestia's invisible presence was the framework holding everything together. Without it, even ordinary life unraveled. Heroes faced the same reality. Heracles' labors take him across the world, but tragedy quietly accumulates in his household during his absence. Jason's Golden Fleece adventure secures fame, but domestic disaster greets him on his return. Courage, strength, and ingenuity cannot replace attention to the hearth. Ordinary, mundane attention, feeding the fire, maintaining rituals, and honoring rituals produces consequences that outlast spectacular adventures. The myths insist that stability is more essential than heroism in the long term. Mortals in everyday stories experience similar patterns. Skipping small obligations, neglecting domestic duties, or failing to maintain rituals produces slow, cumulative disorder. Families fracture, children grow up with instability, alliances weaken, and communities falter. Greek myths treat these outcomes with understated gravity. Hestia's power lies not in dramatic intervention, but in persistence. The quiet center structures the world, shaping consequences far beyond immediate recognition. There is a subtle irony in all this. Greek myths celebrate adventure, heroism, and spectacle, yet the most lasting influence comes from mundane, uncelebrated acts of care. Fires left unattended, rituals skipped, domestic duties ignored. These minor failures often produce consequences far greater than any dramatic battle. Hestia's invisible power is the quiet scale upon which success, failure, and morality are measured. Chapter 22. The slow burn of unattended fires. In Greek mythology, it is easy to get caught up in battles, monsters, and heroic exploits, but beneath all the noise, the most persistent consequences often stem from quiet, unremarkable neglect, particularly of the hearth, the center, the home that Hestia oversees. Her influence is subtle, invisible, yet it shapes outcomes across generations. Leave the hearth unattended, and even the most spectacular feats cannot prevent slow, cumulative disorder. Consider minor myths of settlers and colonists. Founders carried embers from their mother cities, a symbolic and literal connection to continuity. If the fire was neglected, skipped, or treated carelessly, subtle disasters ensued. Crops failed, social structures weakened, and traditions decayed. No divine punishment struck instantly, no monsters destroyed settlements, yet over time the community faltered. The quiet, unassuming fire was the backbone of survival. Its absence revealed just how dependent life was on ordinary attentiveness. Heroes illustrate this principle repeatedly. Heracles' labors take him across the known world, but tragedy quietly accumulates in his household during his absence. Jason's Golden Fleece adventure secures fame, but domestic disaster greets him on his return. Courage, strength, and ingenuity cannot replace attention to the hearth. Ordinary, mundane attention, feeding the fire, maintaining rituals, and honoring rituals produces consequences that outlast spectacular adventures.
Even mortals in everyday Greek myth experience similar patterns. Skipping a ritual, neglecting small domestic duties, or overlooking routine obligations produces slow, cumulative disorder. Children grow up in instability, families fracture, alliances weaken, communities falter. Greek myths treat these outcomes with quiet seriousness, showing that neglect of ordinary responsibilities has effects as real as any monster or divine wrath. Hestia's domain, the hearth, the home, the ordinary routines that structure life, operates in this subtle register. Ignore it, even briefly, and the ripples of disorder extend far beyond what anyone immediately perceives. Consider the stories of colonial founders. They carried embers from their mother cities, a literal and symbolic representation of continuity. A neglected fire, a skipped ritual, a moment's carelessness, these small acts of inattention could destabilize entire settlements. Crops failed, social cohesion weakened, ritual legitimacy eroded. No monsters attacked, no gods struck in vengeance, yet over months and years, instability built until survival itself became uncertain. Hestia's quiet influence was the invisible framework holding everything together. Heroes, too, demonstrate the consequences of absent attention. Heracles' labors take him across the world, leaving his household vulnerable to tragedy. Jason's Golden Fleece adventure secures fame, but his domestic life collapsed upon return. Courage, intelligence, and valor cannot replace the quiet acts of care that preserve the hearth. Myth after myth underscores the principle. Domestic maintenance, continuity, and ordinary attentiveness are more consequential than spectacular exploits. Hestia's invisible power is the uncelebrated scale upon which the world measures itself. Next, we will continue exploring myths in which small oversights escalate into cumulative consequences, further illustrating the indispensable, quiet power of the hearth and the stabilizing force it provides for mortals, heroes, and even gods.
There is an enduring irony in Greek myth. The loudest feats, the most celebrated adventures, and the grandest acts of heroism are constantly dependent on quiet attentiveness. Fires left unattended, rituals skipped, domestic duties ignored. These small lapses often generate consequences more lasting than any epic exploit. Hestia's invisible power quietly maintains the framework upon which mortal, heroic, and divine stories unfold. Chapter 25. The Long Reach of Quiet Neglect. Greek myths reward the bold, the clever, and the daring, but they also warn, in subtle and persistent ways, that neglect of the ordinary can outweigh even the most spectacular heroics. Hestia's domain, the hearth, the home, the center of continuity, is invisible but foundational. Ignore it, and small lapses accumulate, producing consequences that ripple outward, quietly shaping lives, households, and entire communities. Consider the minor myths of settlers and colonists. They carried embers from their mother cities, ensuring continuity and ritual legitimacy in new settlements. When the fire was neglected or rituals skipped, the consequences were subtle but enduring. Crops failed, social bonds weakened, and traditions eroded. No dramatic catastrophe struck immediately, no monsters or divine wrath appeared. Yet over months and years, instability crept in. Hestia's invisible hand maintained order when attended, and its absence was felt whenever neglect occurred. Heroes are not immune to the same principle. Heracles' labors take him across the known world, leaving his household vulnerable to quiet misfortune. Jason retrieves the Golden Fleece, yet his domestic life collapses upon his return. Courage, ingenuity, and strength cannot replace ordinary attention to the hearth. Myth after myth emphasizes that domestic care, continuity, and mundane attentiveness carry consequences far lasting than any heroic exploits. Even ordinary mortals in Greek myth experience this principle. Ignored obligations, skipped rituals, or neglected household duties accumulate into instability. Families fracture, children grow up with uncertainty, alliances weaken, and communities falter. Greek myths treat these outcomes with understated gravity. Hestia's power is structural, invisible, and enduring. The hearth anchors mortal and divine affairs alike.
The gods themselves recognize this pattern indirectly. Demeter's grief over Persephone halts fertility, illustrating the broad effects of absence from the center. Zeus punishes hubris, but only after neglect has accumulated and destabilized order. Apollo's prophecies are meaningless if ignored. Hestia does not intervene overtly. Her influence is quiet and structural. She measures success, failure, and morality without spectacle, and the stories unfold around her silent authority. There is an ironic contrast throughout Greek myth. The loud, celebrated feats, the battles, labors, and adventures depend on the quiet, mundane care of the hearth. Fires left unattended, rituals skipped, domestic duties neglected. These minor lapses produce consequences often more lasting than heroic exploits. Hestia's invisible influence is the uncelebrated yet indispensable framework upon which myths, lives, and even God's plans unfold. Chapter 26. When Tiny Lapses Shape Destiny. Greek myths are loud, dramatic, and obsessed with heroic deeds and divine interventions. Yet beneath all the spectacle lies a quieter, more persistent force, the ordinary, the mundane, the ongoing attentiveness that sustains life. Hestia's domain, the hearth, the home, the center of continuity, is invisible but foundational. Ignore it, and small lapses quietly ripple outward, shaping destinies in ways that heroes and gods often fail to anticipate. Consider the stories of settlers and founders. They carried embers from their mother cities, symbols of continuity and legitimacy. A neglected fire, a skipped ritual, or a failure to maintain domestic order could destabilize entire communities. Crops failed, social bonds weakened, and traditions eroded. No dramatic catastrophe struck immediately. No monsters or divine wrath appeared. Yet over time, disorder accumulated. Hestia's influence, though unseen, was the foundation upon which survival depended. Heroes exemplify the same principle. Heracles' labors take him across the known world, leaving his household vulnerable to quiet tragedy. Jason achieves glory by retrieving the Golden Fleece, yet his domestic life collapses upon his return. Courage, ingenuity, and strength cannot replace attentiveness to the hearth. Myth after myth emphasizes that domestic care, continuity, and ordinary responsibility carry consequences far beyond those of even the most spectacular exploits. Mortals in everyday myths experience similar patterns. Overlooked obligations, neglected rituals, or lapses in household management accumulate into disorder. Children grow up in instability, families fracture, alliances weaken, and communities falter. Greek myths treat these outcomes with understated gravity. Hestia's power is structural, invisible, and enduring. The hearth anchors mortal and divine affairs alike. The gods themselves recognize this pattern indirectly. Demeter's grief over Persephone halts fertility, illustrating the broad effects of absence from the center. Zeus punishes hubris, but only after neglect has accumulated and destabilized order. Apollo's prophecies are meaningless if ignored. Hestia does not intervene overtly. Her influence is quiet and structural. She measures success, failure, and morality without spectacle, and the stories unfold around her silent authority. There is an ironic contrast throughout Greek myth. The loud, celebrated feats, the battles, labors, and adventures depend on the quiet, mundane care of the hearth. Fires left unattended, rituals skipped, domestic duties neglected. These minor lapses produce consequences often more lasting than heroic exploits. Hestia's invisible influence is the uncelebrated yet indispensable framework upon which myths, lives, and even God's plans unfold. Chapter 26. When Tiny Lapses Shape Destiny. Greek myths are loud, dramatic, and obsessed with heroic deeds and divine interventions. Yet beneath all the spectacle lies a quieter, more persistent force, the ordinary, the mundane, the ongoing attentiveness that sustains life. Hestia's domain, the hearth, The home, the center of continuity, is invisible but foundational. Ignore it, and small lapses quietly ripple outward, shaping destinies in ways that heroes and gods often fail to anticipate. Consider the stories of settlers and founders. They carried embers from their mother cities, symbols of continuity and legitimacy. A neglected fire, a skipped ritual, or a failure to maintain domestic order could destabilize entire communities. Crops failed, social bonds weakened, and traditions eroded. No dramatic catastrophe struck immediately. No monsters or divine wrath appeared. Yet over time, disorder accumulated. Hestia's influence, though unseen, was the foundation upon which survival depended. Heroes exemplify the same principle. Heracles' labors take him across the known world, leaving his household vulnerable to quiet tragedy. Jason achieves glory by retrieving the Golden Fleece, yet his domestic life collapses upon his return. Courage, ingenuity, and strength cannot replace attentiveness to the hearth. Myth after myth emphasizes that domestic care, continuity, and ordinary responsibility carry consequences far beyond those of even the most spectacular exploits. Mortals in everyday myths experience similar patterns. Overlooked obligations, neglected rituals, or lapses in household management accumulate into disorder. Children grow up in instability, families fracture, alliances weaken, and communities falter. Greek myths treat these outcomes with understated gravity. Hestia's power is structural, invisible, and enduring. The hearth anchors mortal and divine affairs alike. The gods themselves recognize this pattern indirectly. Demeter's grief over Persephone halts fertility, illustrating the broad effects of absence from the center. Zeus punishes hubris, but only after neglect has accumulated and destabilized order. Apollo's prophecies are meaningless if ignored. Hestia does not intervene overtly. Her influence is quiet and structural. She measures success, failure, and morality without spectacle, and the stories unfold around her silent authority. There is an ironic contrast throughout Greek myth. The loud, celebrated feats, the battles, labors, and adventures depend on the quiet, mundane care of the hearth. Fires left unattended, rituals skipped, domestic duties neglected. These minor lapses produce consequences often more lasting than heroic exploits. Hestia's invisible influence is the uncelebrated yet indispensable framework upon which myths, lives, and even gods' plans unfold. Chapter 2.
Minor myths of colonists illustrate this principle clearly. Founders carried embers from their mother cities, maintaining a literal and symbolic connection to tradition and continuity. When the fire was neglected, rituals skipped, or domestic care ignored, subtle instability emerged. Crops failed, communities fractured, traditions eroded. Nothing dramatic happened immediately. No monster struck, no divine punishment, but over time, disorder mounted. Hestia's quiet influence sustained survival, and her absence highlighted the importance of attentiveness. Heroes demonstrate the same pattern. Heracles' labors take him far from home, leaving his household exposed to quiet misfortune. Jason's retrieval of the Golden Fleece brings fame, yet domestic collapse awaits him upon return. Courage, cleverness, and strength cannot substitute for attention to the hearth. Ordinary maintenance, feeding the fire, preserving domestic order, and honoring rituals carry consequences that endure far longer than the feats that earn fame. Myth after myth underscores that stability and continuity are more consequential than heroism alone. Mortals in everyday life follow this principle as well. Skipped rituals, neglected domestic duties, and overlooked obligations produce cumulative instability. Families fracture, children grow up in uncertainty, alliances weaken, and communities falter. Greek myths treat these outcomes with quiet seriousness. Hestia's power is structural and enduring. The hearth,
the domestic center, anchors both mortal and divine affairs. Even the gods reflect this principle indirectly. Demeter's grief when Persephone is taken halts fertility, illustrating how absence from the center produces cascading effects. Zeus punishes hubris, but only after cumulative neglect destabilizes order. Apollo's prophecies are meaningless if ignored. Hestia herself does not intervene overtly. Her influence is persistent, invisible, and stabilizing. Success, failure, and morality are all measured against the quiet stability she embodies. The irony is persistent. Greek myths glorify heroic deeds, adventure, and spectacle, yet the most enduring consequences often stem from quiet attentiveness or the lack thereof. Fires left unattended, rituals skipped, domestic duties ignored. These minor lapses frequently generate results far more lasting than any epic feat. Hestia's invisible power quietly shapes outcomes across generations, providing the uncelebrated yet indispensable framework for mortal, heroic, and divine stories alike. Chapter 28: Unnoticed Neglect, Persistent Consequences. Greek myths are full of dramatic exploits, terrifying monsters, and divine interference. But beneath all that noise, the most enduring effects often come from quiet, ordinary lapses. Hestia's domain, the hearth, the home, the steady anchor of continuity, operates invisibly, yet it shapes outcomes across generations. Neglected, even briefly, and small failures accumulate, producing consequences that ripple quietly but persistently through households, communities, and even the divine sphere. Minor myths of settlers illustrate this principle clearly. Founders carried embers from their mother cities, maintaining both a literal and symbolic connection to continuity and legitimacy. If the fire was neglected or rituals skipped, subtle problems arose. Crops faltered, social bonds weakened, traditions eroded. Nothing dramatic happened immediately. No monster struck, no divine wrath descended. Yet over months and years, the effects of inattention mounted. Hestia's invisible power maintained the backbone of survival, and its absence revealed how crucial ordinary attentiveness was to life. Heroes also exemplify this pattern. Heracles' labors take him far from home, leaving his household exposed to quiet misfortune. Jason's retrieval of the Golden Fleece brings fame, but domestic collapse awaits him upon return. Courage, cleverness, and strength cannot substitute for care of the hearth. Ordinary maintenance, feeding the fire, preserving domestic order, and honoring rituals has consequences that endure far beyond heroic exploits. Myth after myth underscores that stability and attentiveness to the center are more consequential than adventure or glory. Mortals in everyday life follow the same principle. Skipped rituals, neglected domestic duties, and overlooked obligations accumulate into instability. Families fracture, children grow up in uncertainty, alliances weaken, and communities falter. Greek myths treat these outcomes with understated seriousness. Hestia's power is structural and enduring. The hearth, the domestic center, anchors both mortal and divine affairs. Even the gods reflect this principle indirectly. Demeter's grief when Persephone is taken halts fertility, illustrating how absence from the center produces cascading effects. Zeus punishes hubris, but only after cumulative neglect destabilizes order. Apollo's prophecies are meaningless if ignored. Hestia herself does not intervene overtly. Her influence is persistent, invisible, and stabilizing. Success, failure, and morality are all measured against the quiet stability she embodies. The irony is persistent. Greek myths glorify heroic deeds, adventure, and spectacle, yet the most enduring consequences often stem from quiet attentiveness or the lack thereof. Fires left unattended, rituals skipped, domestic duties ignored. These minor lapses frequently generate results far more lasting than any epic feat. Hestia's invisible power quietly shapes outcomes across generations, providing the uncelebrated yet indispensable framework for mortal, heroic, and divine stories alike. Chapter 28: Unnoticed Neglect, Persistent Consequences. Greek myths are full of dramatic exploits, terrifying monsters, and divine interference. But beneath all that noise, the most enduring effects often come from quiet, ordinary lapses. Hestia's domain, the hearth, the home, the steady anchor of continuity, operates invisibly, yet it shapes outcomes across generations. Neglected, even briefly, and small failures accumulate, producing consequences that ripple quietly but persistently through households, communities, and even the divine sphere. Minor myths of settlers illustrate this principle clearly. Founders carried embers from their mother cities, maintaining both a literal and symbolic connection to continuity and legitimacy. If the fire was neglected or rituals skipped, subtle problems arose. Crops faltered, social bonds weakened, traditions eroded. Nothing dramatic happened immediately. No monster struck, no divine wrath descended. Yet over months and years, the effects of inattention mounted. Hestia's invisible power maintained the backbone of survival, and its absence revealed how crucial ordinary attentiveness was to life. Heroes also exemplify this pattern. Heracles' labors take him far from home, leaving his household exposed to quiet misfortune. Jason's retrieval of the Golden Fleece brings fame, but domestic collapse awaits him upon return. Courage, cleverness, and strength cannot substitute for care of the hearth. Ordinary maintenance, feeding the fire, preserving domestic order, and honoring rituals has consequences that endure far beyond heroic exploits. Myth after myth underscores that stability and attentiveness to the center are more consequential than adventure or glory. Mortals in everyday life follow the same principle. Skipped rituals, neglected domestic duties, and overlooked obligations accumulate into instability. Families fracture, children grow up in uncertainty, alliances weaken, and communities falter. Greek myths treat these outcomes with understated seriousness. Hestia's power is structural and enduring. The hearth, the domestic center, anchors both mortal and divine affairs. Even the gods reflect this principle indirectly. Demeter's grief when Persephone is taken halts fertility, illustrating how absence from the center produces cascading effects. Zeus punishes hubris, but only after cumulative neglect destabilizes order. Apollo's prophecies are meaningless if ignored. Hestia herself does not intervene overtly. Her influence is persistent, invisible, and stabilizing. Success, failure, and morality are all measured against the quiet stability she embodies. The irony is persistent. Greek myths glorify heroic deeds, adventure, and spectacle, yet the most enduring consequences often stem from quiet attentiveness or